Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome back scholars. I hope everybody had a good day today, right? Wednesday blues. Anyway, so a couple of people are already here. Hi Sreshta, good evening. Hello Ayush. Yes, so before we let other people join, in the meantime we'll quickly do our introductions, right? So as you all know, my name is Nikitha and I'm the history educator teaching at Unacademy's Scholars channel, and yes, I am taking classes for standard 11th and 12th. Yesterday actually, when I was taking a class for standard 11, a couple of 12th joined because probably they were confused about the timings and the days of the week, right? So I just want to reiterate my point again here regarding the schedule of the classes. It's Monday, Wednesday and Friday, right? Like these 3 days of the week your classes are going to happen, like 12 standard classes are going to take place, right? So the Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays are not for y'all, so please don't get confused about the scheduling as such, right? Yes, so we'll quickly do the daily rituals we have today. Like there's a Unacademy Scholars channel on Telegram, guys. If y'all are not a part of it as of now, y'all can go join the Scholars channel. You'll be basically getting updates about what sessions are happening at what points of time. You'll also be getting notes or like presentations, right? So just being a part of the Telegram channel itself, you'll have a lot of advantages. So if you want, the link is in the description below. You can go and join the channel. And yes, before moving forward, let's just have a quick look at the Unacademy Plus and Iconic subscriptions. The first benefit or you can actually avail by subscribing to Unacademy Plus is that you can actually sit at the comfort of your own homes and listen to some of the live classes taught by the top educators of India, and all these are available on one single platform, right? There is also unlimited access to all the courses, all the subjects and disciplines, right? And there are also regular doubt solving sessions along with answer writing sessions. You can also take part in practice tests and live test series to evaluate your performance over the last couple of months or weeks, right? And another thing here is every educator at Unacademy Plus, they make sure that they are covering the syllabus in a very exhaustive manner. So you really don't have to worry about missing out on a particular topic, right? And there's also mentorship given to you, guidance given to you as to how to go about your studies, how to go about your board examinations, right? So that sort of guidance is given along with study materials in the form of PDFs, which you can access later on for any queries or doubts you have, like a revision right before the exam, right? So if you look at the Unacademy Plus subscriptions pricing, you might actually see a difference here today because there's a slight difference in the structure of the pricing, right? So now there are not just 5 ranges of subscriptions, but there are 6. So if you clearly see here, there's an add-on for 3 months and 9 months. The initial 6-month subscription was taken away. In place of that, we have 2 new subscriptions, which is for 3 months and 9 months, and then the remaining are the same. 12 months, 15, 18 and 24, right? So according to that, there's a slight differentiation in the prices as well. So please have a look at this slide. The prices are clearly available. If anyone wants to subscribe, I would highly recommend subscribe for a longer period because that will be more beneficial to you all in the longer run, right? And not just that, Unacademy also has iconic subscriptions. Here the features are even better and greater than the plus subscriptions in the sense that you will be given personal mentorship. There's also live doubt solving sessions along with weekly reports given to y'all, and there's also a direct parent connect along with the study planners, right? So if you look at the iconic subscription pricing as well, there is a slight change here. In place of the 6 months, we have added 2 new subscriptions, which are 3 months and 9 months, by taking the 6 months one away, and the rest are the same: 12, 15, 18 and 24, right? So according to that, there's a slight changes in the prices as well. You can please have a look at it. And yes, so we will move into the topic, but before that, hello and good evening to everyone who just joined. Yes, hi Shrestha. Anyway, so we'll go ahead without any further ado, because we have a lot of material to cover today, right? So in the last class, we ended by talking about the structures of the stupa, right? Like there's a dome structure, and on that there is an umbrella structure and all that stuff. So today we will be discussing about sub-theme number 8 and sub-theme number 9 of your textbook. We're basically still dealing with chapter 4, right? Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings. So under that, the 8th subtext is named as Discovering Stupas, the Fate of Amravati and Sanchi, right? Like, so in this section, we will be talking about Amravati Stupa and Sanchi Stupa in a great detail, right? So the next couple of slides are about this. Yes, so if you look at anything in history, right, like not just history, if you look at anything around you, even today, it has a particular history of its own, right? So in the same manner, these Amravati stupas and Sanchi stupa also, they had a history of its own, right? Sometimes these can be histories or stories related to how they were built, right? Like at what point of time were they built, who built these, who donated or funded for these constructions, right? So how were they built, what was the architecture or sculpture used, and all that stuff. That is one part of the history. But the other part of the history is that the history of the discovery, right? So at what point did people or scholars slash historians discover that particular architecture or like a building or monument, right? So in this case, if you look at Sanchi, we've already known that Sanchi was built somewhere around in the year 4th century BCE, right? But the time it was discovered is in the year 1818, right? Like just 2 centuries before. So one thing you need to remember here is the date of construction and the date of discoveries is totally different for any monument or for any temple, sculpture, whatever it is, for any material remains existing in the modern day, right? Yes. So that was the first point of the slide, and we'll talk a little bit about Amaravati Stupa in the beginning, then we'll proceed on to the Sanchi. So in the year 1796, right? So in that particular year, a local Raja, like within the Amaravati premises. So just for your geographical information, Amaravati is in present day Andhra Pradesh. If any of y'all have any idea about the Guntur city in Andhra Pradesh, Amaravati is right there, right? Like a couple of kilometers away from Guntur, right? So in that region, the local king in the year 1796 wanted to build a temple, right? He wanted to build a temple, and by chance he came across this site where Amaravati Stupa was located, right? So in order for the construction to happen, he thought that he will destroy the temple, destroy the stupa, the Amaravati Stupa, and take the stone from there, like the already existing material or the basically the stone which was used in the construction of Amaravati Stupa. He thought that he will destroy the Amaravati Stupa and take the stone from the stupa and build another temple, right? And he also thought that, like, he just didn't realize that that was like a Buddhist chaitya or like a Buddhist stupa. He just saw it as some kind of random hill, right, or some kind of random mound, right? Because all these stupas or mounds, as we have discovered, or as we have talked about, they are on an elevated platform, right? So just by looking at that stupa, he thought that it was some kind of random hill or a mound, but not an actual Amravati stupa. So for that reason, he thought of destroying it and taking away the stone. And he also thought that there might be some treasure hidden within that particular hill. So he thought he can loot that also, like he can acquire that also. But for some reason he couldn't do that. So Amravati stupa was still in place. But the story just didn't end there. A couple of years or a couple of decades later, a British official named Colin Mackenzie, right? Again, these are very important names. If possible, just please remember at least their first names, if not for the entirety of the names, guys, right? Yes, so a British officer by name Colin Mackenzie, he visited the Amravati stupa. When did he do that? A couple of years after the local Raja wanted to destroy the stupa, right? So when he visited it, he studied about the stupa in a great detail. Like he visited every, like he visited and he looked after every sculpture, every building, every wall, every gateway, right? Like he examined all of those and he made a detailed notes. Not just that, he also like drew some figures of the stupa, right? Like the structure of the stupa and all that stuff. But this material was never published, right? So that is one thing about the Amravati stupa. That is why we don't have much information about Amravati stupa. Even though the studies were conducted, scholars examined it, but unfortunately the reports were never published, like they were never made public. So that is why we don't have a lot of information about Amravati stupa as we do about the Sanchi stupa, right? So that was that. And till here, any questions, guys? I mean, it was a pretty easy slide, but if you all have any questions. Okay, so Unnati, to answer your question, yes, like whatever is written on the slides, it is like I've almost covered every line which I thought is important from your textbook. So you don't have to worry about again going back and reading your textbook. Everything is there on these slides itself. And yes, I am making it a point to cover every line of it. I understand your concern, Unnati, but again, thanks for raising the concern. I get it. Yes. Oh, okay. So Ayush has a question as to who wanted to destroy the Amravati stupa, right? Like, so in the year 1796, as I was telling, which is also in the previous slide, we don't know the local Raja's name, but like some local chieftain or some local king who was ruling that particular Amravati region, he was a Hindu king, right? So he wanted to build a temple, like a Hindu temple. So he wanted to build it in the same location where the Amravati stupa was there. So that is why he thought of destroying it and building a Hindu temple in place of that. But for some reasons or for some factors, he couldn't do it. So Amravati stupa was never destroyed. It was still in place, right? So, but again, it's like an anonymous name, anonymous king or an anonymous Raja, right? Sangeeta, you're asking about the 11th class queries, right? But yeah, which is not a part of the today's class. But again, just to clarify your doubt, if you're 11th standard student, yes, we will be talking about writing and city life itself from next class. So don't worry about that. We will not be discussing about theme 1 in detail, right? Yes, Ayush, you're absolutely right regarding Colin Mackenzie discovering Vijayanagara Empire, but we're not dealing with that right now. But when time comes, we will look at it in detail. But yes, your point is absolutely correct. Cool, cool. So if that is the thing, we can continue. Yes, so moving on a couple of decades even earlier, right? The last thing we looked at was 1796, and then we've talked about Colin Mackenzie. But now here we move on to the year 1854. Another important incident happened with regards to Amaravati Stupa, right? So here we'll be talking about Walter Elliot, another important name to remember. Who was he, right? Like the question is, who was he? Why are we talking about him, right? So he was the commissioner of Guntur, right? Guntur is right next to Amaravati, just a couple of kilometers away from Amaravati. So he was ruling over that region, like he was the commissioner for that region. So he visited Amaravati, right? And he visited the stupa, and he collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras, right? He was a scholar himself, like he was a historian slash archaeologist himself. He went to Amaravati Stupa. He collected some of those sculptures, right? Like for example, gateways or some portions of the walls or some other sculptures as a part of the stupa. He collected all those panels and took them away to Madras, present day Chennai, right? So he took them away, like mostly they were marbles. The things which he took away are marbles. So those marbles in the later times came to be known as the Elliot marbles. They were basically named after him, right? Like his name was Walter Elliot. That is why those marbles were also named as Elliot marbles, right? So what are we looking at? Like why are we studying this point? The point being, the original structure of the stupa was no more in Amaravati, right? Some parts of it, even though like not the whole of the stupa, but at least some part of it, some marbles of the stupa, they were taken away to a different place, right? They were taken away to Madras. So that is not what the preservation process wants. People who ever want to preserve the stupa doesn't want that to happen, right? But in 1854, Walter Elliot did that. He took away some of the marbles of the stupa, right? And he also discovered the remains of Western Gateway, right? Like his contribution to Amaravati Stupa. Like this point is basically about his contribution. What did he do was he discovered the remains of Western Gateway. One point to remember is, as we've talked about in the last class, every stupa has 4 gateways in 4 directions: north, south, east and west. And Eastern Gateway is somehow considered to be like the or like important gateway, and people always entered the stupa via the Eastern Gateway, right? So when it comes to Amaravati Stupa, by the 19th century, for some reason, be it natural calamities or be it ravages of time, Western Gateway collapsed. Like Western Gateway was not in its place, but other 3 gateways are intact, and Western Gateway collapsed, right? So what did Walter Elliot do? He discovered the remains of the Western Gateway, right? He also examined the stupa in general, and he came to a conclusion that the structure of Amaravati, or basically the Amaravati stupa, was one of the largest and important Buddhist stupas, right? We have seen that there are n number of stupas in the Indian subcontinent, like in the different parts of Indian subcontinent, but out of all of them, Amaravati was like the most important because it was the largest and also the most magnificent Buddhist stupa that was ever built back in those times, right? So that is how important the Amaravati stupa is, right? So not just in 1854, but throughout the 1850s, different parts of Amaravati stupa were taken away to different places by different people, right? So the structure in itself started losing its originality. Like the totality of the structure was no more there. People started taking away parts of it to different places. For example, some parts were taken to Asiatic Society of Bengal, right? That Asiatic Society of Bengal is in present day Kolkata. And not just that, they also took them to the India office in Madras. And it was not just restricted to the Indian subcontinent, but they were also taken to some parts of London, right? Like who basically took these parts to London, right? Usually all these English officers who were serving in India, once their tenure is over, like they were not permanent officers, they always had like a tenure to them, or like resignation and all that stuff, right? Like retirement and stuff. So once they are returning back to their homeland, they used to take these pieces of different stupas with them to their own country, right? And they used to keep them in their gardens as decorative pieces. Again, what is the basic point underlying this? We're losing the originality of the structure, right? And looking at the fact that previous officers did it, even the new officers started doing the same. They were like, my previous officer took this particular part away to his home, why can't I take it, right? So that level of competition is like, I want it, right? That greed. So they started taking away all these different parts to their own country and use them as decorative pieces back in their homes, right? So again, the underlying point is the losing, or like we are losing the originality of the structure, right? So that is why I had to explain this whole slide. Any questions still here? Okay, I don't see any questions. Yeah, so if not for that, then we can move on, right? So that was about the previous slide. So now we will move on a couple of decades even further and talk about an archaeologist by name H. Cole. Like you can see his figure here. Basically H abbreviates to Henry Hardy Cole, right? Like his name was Henry Hardy Cole. With regards to taking away these parts of the structure, he had a different view. Like he opposed that, right? In one of his journals or like in one of his publications, he specifically writes that, quote unquote, what he says is, it seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art, right? So he's basically saying, by people taking away all these ancient art and architecture structures, the nation as a whole, or like the Indian country as a whole, is being looted. Looted by what? Looted of its original work, right? So it kind of seems to him as if it was like a suicidal policy. So he was clearly against the idea of people taking away parts of the structure to their own homeland, right? Instead of that, he gives an alternative solution to it. He basically says that if you're really interested in all these sculptures, if you really want all these pieces to be established at your own houses, right, make a copy of it using plaster of Paris or plastic or some other metal. Make a copy of the sculpture and keep that as a decorative piece, right? Don't take away all this originalness or the original structure from the site. Instead, make a plaster copy, right? That was an alternative solution given by him to people who wanted to take away these structures, right? That was the idea he had, and that was the protest he was making. But unfortunately, he couldn't convince the authorities about his plan about the same point when it comes to Amaravati Stupa, right? People started taking away parts of Amaravati Stupa and used it for their own needs. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't convince the authorities to stop it. But when it comes to Sanchi, on the other hand, the Sanchi Stupa, he was successful in convincing his authorities, right? Like he basically plead for in situ preservation. In situ preservation is nothing but preserving the structure or preserving the site in its original location, right? I get it. Like even if you take parts of it and keep it at your place, at your own houses, it will still be there, right? The structure will still be there, but it is not in its original place. right? So in situ preservation means preservation has to happen, but where? In its original location, right? So he was successful in asking the officials to preserve the Sanchi Stupa in the process of in situ preservation, right? So that was the role played by Henry Hardy Cole, and he was successful when it comes to Sanchi Stupa. The fact that we couldn't do it for Amravati basically means we lost most of the Amravati parts. If you come and look at the Amravati Stupa today, like in the 21st century, you'll hardly see anything. Most of its originality is lost. But on the other side, if you go to Sanchi Stupa, it's still there. Like preservation happened very efficiently, right? So that was the point about Henry Cole. Any questions still here, guys? If you all have any questions, please put them down in the chat box. Okay, I will move on to the next slide, but if you all have any queries regarding this or the previous slides, please put your questions down. Yeah. Again, the point here is, as I was telling you, if you look at the Amravati Stupa, we don't have the originality remaining. But if you look at the Sanchi, the original structure is still there. Why? Why did that happen? Right? Again, I kind of touched on this point, but we'll look at it in great detail here. The answer given to this question as to why Sanchi is surviving and Amravati is not surviving is that perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds, right? Till a certain point of time in history, scholars did not realize the value of the finds. They played with the structures. Sometimes they destroyed them, sometimes they took them away to different places. But there was one point of time in history where scholars and archaeologists realized the importance and value of those finds, and how critical it is, that how important it is to preserve things in its original location, right? That realization happened much later. So by the time scholars realized the importance of in situ preservation, Amravati Stupa was already destroyed, right? As I was talking, right, in 1850s, 1840s, the destruction of the stupa was already happening as people started taking away parts of it to different places. But when it comes to Sanchi, that is not the case, because people realized the importance of the finds, right? So that was like a simple solution to why did it happen the way it happened, right? Yes. Again, as I was telling you, when it comes to Sanchi, in the year 1818 it was discovered, and 3 of its 4 gateways were still there, and the 4th one was for some reason destroyed, and it was laying on the spot, right? But the mound was in a pretty good condition, right? So even after looking at Sanchi Stupa, there were some people, as we have discussed I think in class 1 of this chapter, where we talked about how some French people and English people want to take away the eastern gateway of Sanchi Stupa to their own country museums, right? So we've talked about this point. People want to take away, but because of some preservation efforts by the local Nawabs, right? What is her? I'm not remembering the Nawab's name, but it was some lady Begum, right? I'm not sure about the name, but yes, we've talked about it in class 1, right? So because of her efforts, right, we are able to see the Sanchi Stupa as it is today, because great preservation techniques were in place, and efficiently they were able to they managed to conserve the Sanchi Stupa as a whole, right? And yes, Sanchi is still there. Amravati's is not that great. The initial glory of it is denudant, the reason we have looked at it in the past couple of slides, right? So I hope this point is clear, guys. Yes, Ayush, thank you for reminding. It's Sultan Jahan Begum and Shah Jahan Begum, right? So Shah Jahan was like the mother and her daughter was Sultan Jahan Begum. Thank you, Ayush. Thank you for reminding. Yes, so that was like the 8th sub-theme of your textbook. Now we'll move on to the next sub-theme, which is sculpture, right? Again, a very interesting concept. People whoever are interested in art history in specific, this is for you guys, right? So sculptures we have seen are very like sometimes they might be very minute, sometimes they might be very large, right? But irrespective of that, if you look at how the sculptures were carved out, it is very interesting. They were very talented because carving on a hard surface, especially a surface like stone, is not that easy. It takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of skill, talent, hard work to engrave on the stone, right? So people in ancient India actually did a good job while they were trying to make sculptures, right? So we will look at some of those sculptures in detail here, and what are some of the traditions associated with sculptures and why only they were engraved in the way they are, right? So we look at some of them in detail. So the first one here is stories in stone, right? It's titled Stories in Stone in your textbook, and this is one of the figure you all need to look at in detail for us to understand that stones or all these sculptures on the stones, they have a specific meaning to it. They are not just simply lying there for aesthetic reasons or for decorative purposes, but there is some underlying meaning beneath every sculpture engraved on the stones, right? So if you look at this one in particular, it is a part of your textbook. If the image on the screen is not that clear, you can just go to page number, I think 100 of your textbook, where you will find this figure, and just Google it, otherwise you'll find it. And if you enlarge the figure, basically what you will understand by just looking at the figure is that it's like a village atmosphere or like a village scenario. There are like a lots of huts here, and there are trees, there are people, some places there are also animals, right? So if you look at this background, the first thing which will strike your mind is like a village atmosphere. But if you look at the textual evidences or like texts which describe this sculpture, that is not the case. There is some other story behind it. So that is why we should never take sculptures at the face value. They are always supposed to be studied in juxtaposition to the textual evidences. Only if you combine the textual evidences and the sculptures, then we will get to know the actual hidden meaning, right? So when it comes to this thing in particular, art historians have carefully studied it and identified it as a scene from Vesantara Jataka. Again, Jatakas are basically Buddhist texts, and they are very important sources for us to tell us about the life of Buddha, the teachings of Buddha, how people followed Buddhism and all that stuff. So there are a lot of Jatakas, out of which Vesantara Jataka is one, and this figure tells us a story or a scene from Vesantara Jataka. So the story goes as follows, right? It is a story of a generous prince, right? He is not a king yet. So by the time he was about to inherit the kingdom, he thought that he do not want to become a king. Instead, he gave everything up, like he left everything. He donated it to a Brahmana and he went to live in the forest, right? Like he took his wife, he took his children and went to the forest to live a peaceful life there, right? So that is the scene which is exactly depicted here. right? And that is why it is important for us to not just look at the face value but combine it with the textual evidences, right? Yeah, so I hope this point is clear with regards to a stone or a particular sculpture carrying a certain story within it, right? It's just an example given, but there are hundreds of examples like this if you look at the art history in detail, right? Yeah, so the next topic we'll be dealing with is symbols of worship, right? Especially in relation to Buddhism. So another point we need to remember here before dealing with the symbols itself is that art historians had to acquire familiarity with hagiographies. Guys, again, hagiographies, we've talked about it in the previous class. If any of you all remember what hagiographies are, please quickly put down what they mean in the chat box, right? What are hagiographies? Type them quickly in the chat box. I just want to see how many people remember what. What essentially are hagiographies, right? We've talked about this in great detail, I think 2 classes back. Yes, Ayush, you're right. I hope everybody else also remember what hagiographies are. They are basically biographies of saints, right? And like who wrote them? The disciples basically wrote these hagiographies. Yes, Ayush, absolutely right. Good job. Anyways, so art historians, what is the job of an art historian, right? They just have to look at the sculptures. They just have to look at the visual mode of communication, right? Like paintings, sculptures, and everything which has a visual medium, right? But if you just look at the sculpture in itself, you're not going to get the exact meaning of it. And that is why it is really important for us, or even the art historians, to look at hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand the scenario in a more efficient manner, right? So art historians did that. They relied on hagiographies to a large extent, right? So according to hagiographies, we know that Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree, right? So again, the normal story we know is Buddha at some point of time attained enlightenment or nirvana, right? But the specificities of it will be known only if you look at the hagiographies, right? So he was meditating under a tree, it was a Bodhi tree, it was in Bodh Gaya. So all these details related to enlightenment, if you study a hagiography, only then you will get to know, right? So that is why they are important. And so the main point of this slide is this. Usually when these sculptures were being made in the ancient times, like in the initial times, they did not show Buddha in a human form, right? Again, this kind of ties back to the formlessness of God, right? So for example, in Hindu religion, we have all these gods depicted in the form of some statues or some sculptures. They have a form to it, right? But when it comes to other religions, right, I think Jainism doesn't have a specific structure to God. Even some sects of Christianity, I think Protestants, right, like even Protestants do not have a form to God. Like they just believe that there is one abstract thing. There is somebody like a supernatural power who is protecting us, but we don't necessarily have a shape and a form to it, right? So even in early Buddhism, people kind of believe that the God is shapeless or formless or do not have like a physical form, and that is why Buddha was never depicted in a human form. It was always like an abstract thing. Instead, sculptures used symbols to depict what is happening, right? For example, there are images like empty seats or trees, right? So empty seats basically meant that Buddha was meditating, right? So if you have a look at this figure, this is what I'm talking about. The first one, there is a seat here, like an empty seat, and there are all these trees. Like this was supposed to be like a bodhi tree, right? This is the sculpture you will find, but Buddha is never a part of the sculpture. There is no human form depicted here. But if you look at an empty seat, we need to understand that this basically means that Buddha is sitting under the Bodhi tree and he is meditating, right? So these are some of the symbols used by early sculptures, right? So, and the other one is stupa, right? Here you have the stupa. This image shows us the stupa, and people are worshipping that stupa. And stupa basically referred to nirvana, right? And the last one here is the wheel, right? So wheel again had a particular significance in the Buddhist traditions. So if you look at the wheel here, it signifies the first sermon at Sarnath, the place where Buddha basically delivered his first teachings, right? So these are some of the symbols used in the early times, right? Yes, Ayush, you're right. They don't basically support idol worship or like an idolatry, right? Right. So I hope people got that point. And yes, again, that is why the fact that if you look at something, if you look at an empty seat, and if you don't know what it symbolizes, it is just an empty seat for you, right? In the same way, if you look at some sculpture and if you find a tree, right, it's just simply a tree without any particular meaning. But if you have a textual evidence alongside, if you're looking at the sculpture and the textual evidence together, the textual evidence is going to tell you what that tree symbolizes or what the empty seat symbolizes, right? So these symbols are always associated to an event in the life of Buddha, right? So that is why again I'm reiterating my point. Textual sources and sculptures are important for us to read them together, right? And yes, so the last point here is, in order to understand them, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produce these works of art, right? When a particular sculptor is engraving all these sculptures, right? He had something in mind, or like he is following a particular tradition, and that is how he is carving all these works of art, right? So in order for historian to know what is the intent of the sculpture, he needs to familiarize himself by looking at the books, right? Oh, okay. So I hope this slide is clear. But to answer Ayush's question, what is Mahaparinirvana? Again, Ayush, it is nothing but nirvana. But as you know, it was like a Sanskritized or like an ancient Indian classical language term. So all these terms which we look at are like the shortest forms of the terms, right? The shortest forms of the actual words. It basically means nirvana, enlightenment, right? But there is always a larger name attached to the names we use in present times. We just can't keep saying Mahaparinirvana every time, right? Like nirvana it's simple. So that's why we call it nirvana. Okay, and also sermon basically means teachings. The first time he delivered his message. Sermons means teachings. I hope that is clear, Ayush. Yeah, so if this slide is clear, then we can move on to the next slide. Right, so this is a look at the pictures. And yeah, the next theme we'll be talking about is popular traditions, right? There are certain traditions associated with every sculpture. Without a meaning or without a tradition, obviously people won't engrave, like people won't invest so much of time and produce such a magnificent artwork. There is definitely a tradition attached to it, right? So we will look at some of those in detail in the next couple of slides. And one thing to understand is that whatever sculptures you find at Sanchi, not just Sanchi but like any Buddhist monument, it is not always linked to Buddhist ideas, or it is not always inspired by Buddhist ideas. Sometimes these sculptures might be made based on people's beliefs and traditions from pre-Buddhist era or something like that, right? So we will look at some of those in detail here. So if you look at this figure, it is very important part of the Sanchi Stupa, right? So this is a woman and she is hanging on to a tree, right? So this is like the gateway. If you look at the whole figure, it is like the gateway of Sanchi Stupa, and within the gateway there is a part of it where a woman is basically hanging on to a tree, right? So we'll see what is the meaning of it, right, in this slide. Yeah, so obviously if you look at a figure like that, we'll be interested, and in the same way scholars initially they were intrigued by what is this image trying to tell us, right? And because honestly, why is it interesting is that it doesn't have anything to do with the Buddhist tradition or like renunciation, right? We've never come across a lady divine figure in Buddhist texts, right? So obviously it is something not a part of Buddhism, and that is why it is interesting. If not a part of Buddhism, why is it a part of the Buddhist stupa, right? A basic question, not just scholars but also we need to ask ourselves, right? So however, the answer to this is given as, and again, after examining so many other literary traditions, not just Buddhist ones but also other non-Buddhist texts, scholars realized that it is a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as a Shalabanjika, right? Again, you don't have to remember what Shalabanjika, like the term of Shalabanjika in itself, but just have a brief idea that it kind of represented a non-Buddhist tradition, right? So what does the popular belief around Shalabanjika says, right? So they say that this is a woman with some supernatural powers, not divine powers but some magical powers. When she touched a tree, that tree immediately bore flowers, or not just flowers but also fruits, right? So if she wants that tree to grow fruits and flowers, then immediately they came up, right? So she kind of had some magical powers, and this is exactly the woman who is called as Shalabanjika and is a part of the Buddhist stupa, right? And it was for some reason considered as an auspicious symbol, right? And that is why it is integrated into the decoration of the stupa, right? So again, we are using the word decoration here. Until now, what we studied is that everything which is engraved as a part of the monument has some religious meaning to it, right? But for the first time, we are coming across the word decorative. Like these are just images incorporated into the sculptures for aesthetic purposes, not because it is affiliated to the Buddhist religion, right? So that is exactly the point I was trying to tell here, right? The Shalabanjika's motif, by looking at that, we will come to a conclusion that Buddhist people who were trying to engrave all these sculptures, they enriched it by adding some aesthetic value, by adding some aesthetic pleasure to it, right? And it not just included ideas from Buddhist tradition, but it also included ideas from pre-Buddhist or basically non-Buddhist beliefs and practices, right? Because clearly Shalabanjika is not a part of Buddhist tradition. she was someone outside the Buddhist tradition, right? But still it was incorporated. So sometimes you will come across figures like these, even though they are not a part of Buddhism, they are still adopted and made a part of the stupa for aesthetic reasons, right? Okay, so that might just be a correction, Ayush, like a printing mistake or something. Anyways, so if this point is clear, we can move on, right? Again, the last point I've covered here, right? It's not just Shalabanjika, but there are several other motifs as well, as a part of the sculptures, as a part of the stupas, that are not directly derived from the Buddhist traditions, right? So other images, if we look at, these are all a couple of examples we are trying to look at in order for us to understand the idea of sculpturing and sculptures in great detail, right? So sometimes you will come across depictions of animals, and most usually the animals found are elephants, horses, monkeys and cattle, right? It is possible that all these animals are a part of the Jataka stories, and that is why they were sculptured on the walls of the stupas. But also, don't forget, these might be included or carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers, right? Like generally, as a human psychology or like a human tendency is to look at things which are attractive, right? Only if it is beautiful or only if it is lively, you want to look at it, right? If it is not that great, if it is not aesthetically pleasing your eyes, you wouldn't want to look at it, right? So that is why, to attract the viewers, they have put in all these elegant images of animals, of Shalabanjika for example, and all that stuff, right? And also, these are all the reasons we can come up with as history students, right? What the intent of the actual sculptor is while engraving all this, we don't know. Probably I'm a sculptor right now, right? I want to engrave something on the walls. My intention might be different, right? But as students of history, when somebody else is looking at this figure, they might come up with different interpretations and different intentions, right? Some might say the intention was because it is a part of Buddhist tradition, it was incorporated into the stupa. Some might say no, it is because of aesthetically pleasing senses, right? So again, different reasons for them. And some also said that animals were used as symbols of human attributes, right? For example, if you look at a figure of elephant, even now if you look at elephant, we kind of try to associate it with strength and wisdom, right? Obviously because of the bulky figure of elephant or like its huge physical structure, we associate it with strength, right? And also wisdom. So when you look at figures on the sculptures, you can kind of associate it with two human attributes, right? Ayush, I don't really think I'm getting your point, but like if what I'm thinking is what you're actually telling, those are non-Buddhist traditions, right? But if you're referring to this part, like the decoration of the stupa, then it is for like a beautiful purpose or something. Yeah. Where was I? Yes. So about the point about elephants is done. And another motif is that of a women surrounded by lotuses and elephants. The figure is exactly right in front of you on your screen, right? This is a woman and there are elephants surrounding that woman, right? So again, if you look at that one particular thing, there are multiple interpretations you can come up with, right? So some saw it as some kind of abhisheka being performed, right? Even in the Hindu traditions right now, if you visit a particular temple, you do that abhisheka, right? Like, how do I explain it? Like abhisheka in terms of pouring milk onto the statue or something like that. That is basically called as abhisheka. So if you look at that figure, have a look at this figure, guys. It looks as if by raising the trunks, the elephants are trying to sprinkle water onto the lady who is sitting there and performing a abhisheka, right? So that is one way in which we can interpret it. The other historians identified it as the figure of Maya. Again, Maya, we've talked about a couple of classes earlier. She was the mother of Buddha, right? So they thought it was the mother of Buddha. But some others thought that it was a popular goddess by name Gajalakshmi, right? Gaja literally translates to elephant, and Gajalakshmi is often associated with elephants, right? So, and she was basically referred to as the goddess of good fortune, right? So these are different interpretations people can come up with. And not just that, some people or some historians, they have usually associated this particular sculpture to the figure of both Maya and Gajalakshmi. They thought that Maya herself was Gajalakshmi, right? So again, you can come up with different interpretations, because when you look at a visual medium, like a visual process of communication, you are free to come up with your own thoughts, right? So that is exactly what happened in this case also. Oh, okay, I get your point, Ayush. If I mention like a Buddhist woman, then it must be like a spelling mistake or something. I'm sorry for that. But yes, I was basically referring to beautiful women hanging from the trees, right? Yeah, please make that correction, guys. Thank you, Ayush, for pointing out. Yeah, so we'll move on to another sculptor, right? This is again a serpent. Serpent is nothing but a snake. This sculpture is also part of the Sanchi Stupa, right? It is not just engraved once on the walls of stupa, on the Sanchi Stupa, but if there are several images or like several sculptures of serpent engraved on several pillars of Sanchi Stupa, right? Like the multiple times. So it seems to be derived from popular traditions which are not always recorded in texts. Again, these are not the Buddhist traditions, because snake doesn't have any significance in the Buddhist traditions. So it is definitely from the non-Buddhist or like a pre-Buddhist tradition, right? So a particular person by name James Ferguson, he was an art historian, right? He was like one of the earliest art historians by name James Ferguson. He actually studied the Sanchi Stupa in great detail, and he came across these figures like serpents, and he came to a conclusion that Sanchi Stupa, like the figure or like the structure there, is a center of tree and serpent worship, because multiple times you can see a lot of trees and serpents engraved on the walls of stupa. So that is why he concluded that Sanchi Stupa was a center of tree and serpent worship. This was the time when he was not familiar with Buddhist literature, right? If you read the Buddhist literature side by side, then you can come up with a different conclusion, right? But the fact that James Ferguson had no idea about the Buddhist literature, because by that time when he was alive, Buddhist literature was not translated into English, and he did not know Pali or Sanskrit languages. That is why, by just looking at the figures, by just looking at the images, he concluded like he basically came to whatever conclusion he had to come, right? Yeah, so this is the last slide for today's class. We'll be talking about paintings here. Again, paintings are also a great visual medium and provides us with a lot of information. If you look at them very carefully, they also depict stories, right? So this slide we're going to talk about paintings, but the problem with paintings is they can easily be destroyed, not voluntarily, but as time passes by. Because of the ravages of time, it is highly possible that a painting is destroyed faster than a stone sculpture. Obviously stones are harder materials, right? So for a stone sculpture to be destroyed, it will take a lot of time. It can, still be there even after surviving the ravages of time, right? But when it comes to paintings, that is not the point, that is not the case, right? So if you look at if anybody of y'all have visited Ajanta caves in the present day Maharashtra, right? So Ajanta caves are these beautiful caves, right? There are n number of caves with different paintings on the walls. They are basically associated with Buddhist religion, because a lot of Buddha images can be found in Ajanta caves, right? So if you look at them, you will find beautiful paintings depicting Buddha's life, like stories of Buddha in his childhood, his teachings, how people followed Buddhism, and everything related to Buddhism. Ajanta caves have all these paintings, right? Again, the topics may range from depictions of courtly life, right? So it also talks about kingdoms in detail, right? A particular king was ruling, let's say, like a Buddhist king. For example, Kanishka or Ashoka. The fact that he was a Buddhist king, his courtly life had something to do with the Buddhist tradition, right? So the courtly life depiction was made, different processions, like some kind of men and women at work, or like daily festivals, whatever it is, like day-to-day life, day-to-day social life, all of them were depicted as stories which are a part of Jatakas on the Ajanta caves, right? Like in the Ajanta caves. And yes, the one important thing, or like the significant thing about all these paintings from Ajanta caves, is that artists were very talented and they used this technique of shading, right? If any of y'all are artists yourself, you'll realize how to make a 3D figure, right? Like a three-dimensional figure. If you give some sort of shading or stroking to it, it basically gets into a 3D figure. I'm not sure about much of how it is done, but if you're an artist yourself, you'll know how the technique of shading is done, right? So that basically gives it a 3D quality. So you will find such paintings in the Ajanta caves, and some of them are really they look very naturalistic. That is how talented the painters were back then, and they drew all these paintings on the walls of caves in Ajanta, right? So that is it we have for today. We're already past time by a couple of minutes, but yes, anyways, any questions still here, please put them down in the chat box before I wind up this session, or you can also put them in the comment box once the live is over, guys. Not just this class, but in the previous sections as well. If you all have any queries, please put them down. I will answer. Okay, so Ayush apparently is very good in sketching. That's a very rare talent, Ayush. I highly appreciate all these artists and painters because I'm really bad at it. Good one. Anyways, cool. So all clear. Yes, so I know it's really tiring because we have been dealing with this chapter for a long period of time right now, but we still do have a couple of sections remaining. I think we still have 2 sub themes to do. theme number 10 and 11. I will try my best to finish it in the next class, which is on Friday, right? So if that is over on Friday, we can have a quiz on Monday. But I'm telling y'all, I will try my best to finish it by next class. So probably we'll have a quiz on Monday, guys. I'm telling y'all a couple of days before. If y'all want to prepare for the quiz, please prepare. And I'll make sure this time the questions are only MCQ based. No fill in the blanks or nothing of that sort, right? Even if I want to give any fill in the blanks or identifying the figures and all that stuff, we'll make sure we'll do it on like a normal YouTube class so that y'all can give answers in the chat box. Because if you're doing it on like a Mentimeter platform, even the spelling mistakes or like it's very case sensitive, right? Like capital letters, small letters, all that is also being taken into account, because of which we faced a lot of problems in the last quiz, right? So we won't do that this time. And yes, most probably we'll be having a quiz on Monday. If we do not complete the syllabus by Friday, then the quiz might be postponed to Wednesday of next week, but I will make it clear by the next class, right? So again, yes, I will quickly wind this up about the pitch made in the beginning of the class. If y'all want to subscribe to Unacademy Plus or Iconic, y'all can use my code TUM10 and get a 10% off straight away while subscribing. And also, if y'all like the content of this videos, please do like the video so that y'all can want more of it, right? And also share as much as possible and subscribe to the channel Unacademy Scholars, right? Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. It was great seeing you all, and I will see you guys again on Friday 6 p.m. right? Don't get confused. Your classes are on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, all at 6 p.m. right? Yes, see you guys on Friday. Have a good evening, guys, till then, and also all the best for tomorrow's whatever activities you'll have, right? Thank you so much for tuning in. See you guys. Good evening. Thank you.